Well, before we dive into our conversation, I want to thank our partner, Belay Solutions. For 15 plus years, Belay has helped pastors lead with confidence. And now they're offering a free resource, the Church Leader's Guide to Financial Clarity. It's a practical tool to help you move from financial guesswork to peace of mind. To download, text Barna to 55123. That's BARNA to 55123. Well, today we are talking about something that every pastor faces: how to create and maintain a healthy staff culture. After our conversation, I will sit down with leadership coach and consultant Jenni Catron from the Foresight Group. But first, I want to hear from you guys about how you approach shaping culture in your church. I'm sure we're all familiar with the idea. Maybe is this a book title, that Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast?
It's a Peter Drucker statement. Yeah.
There we go. And so it's something we really all leaned in on. And so I'd love to hear from you guys what that looks like practically in your context.
I love the Drucker sequence is like first establish culture, then set the strategy, then develop the structure. And I really kind of tried to adhere to that when we arrived at Rock Harbor a little over 3 years ago, was to say, what is the existing culture and the things that we want to steward and bring forward? And then what are some shifts or changes and imprints that we want to co-design and co-shape together? And years ago, I was really helped by Andy Crouch's book, Culture Making, where he talks about you don't change culture by saying head on, hey guys, we're not going to be this anymore. But rather you think of culture making as cultivating, like gardening, and you start to water and cultivate the soil and the seeds that you want, and start to kind of starve out the stuff that you don't. And then I've kind of pulled a little bit from the tools of like a social anthropologist. I had to learn a lot on how to do this stuff when I was doing my doctoral work. And there's Nancy Ammerman at Duke. I think she's at Duke, but like have done such amazing work at applying these tools to like the culture of congregations as congregation studies. That's way too advanced for me. So I've just got a 4-part simple way of thinking about culture. And that is language, stories, rituals, and artifacts. And you could sub out the word rituals for practices: language, stories, practices, and artifacts. And so one of the things for even like a healthy staff culture is to go, well, what's some of the language we use, and it could be things from like, do we have to be there? Is this mandatory? So that it could be language like that. No, we don't use the word mandatory, or we do, a tier 1, tier 2, or A team, B team. I mean, those are all kinds of little ways that language can signal staff culture. There's stories that we tell, where stories that can celebrate the right things, or stories that can actually celebrate or highlight the wrong things. Do we reward people for get the job done at all costs and they didn't, or do we reward people for hidden work? Do we only tell stories of people who are on the platform, or do we also tell stories for people? So storytelling. Practices, I think there's some rhythms that you can kind of audit. Like, what are the things we practice together as a staff? One of my favorite ones, you guys will love this, is every year the staff Christmas party at Rock Harbor for many, many years now is a Disney day. So I said, listen, this tradition will not die on my watch. This will not die on my watch. So we do. So that's like one of the practices. Is a Christmas party at Disney all day. And then finally, artifacts. Artifacts are basically like things like an annual review, or a ministry planning document, or ministry planning process. Anytime you create a system, a process, a document, that's an artifact that enshrines culture. So I don't know, guys. Like, does that help you? I'm sure you have all of these things and more.
No, I love the framework and love Crouch's work on that as well. It's been really helpful for me. Just to tease that out a little bit, for us, when I think about healthy staff culture, and I'm going to riff on some of what you just said, Glenn, I think it has to begin with what already exists that needs to be named and cultivated, as opposed to beginning aspirationally. I want us to be like this, but if that's not anywhere near what already exists, we're going to start off with lots of frustration, because the gap between what is and what we want to be is just too large. And so what are the things that are already part of the culture that we have to say, you know what, this is really working for us, but we've never named it in a way that we can keep cultivating it and have that kind of consistent language in defining it. And so for us, this is fresh because last year, we kind of reinvented or refreshed really our staff culture values. And we landed at 4 staff culture values. One being differentiation, that our distinction doesn't have to lead to disconnection. So how do we negotiate differences well? How do we work through conflict as a staff team? How do we pay attention to our own reactions? That's the differentiation. Second one was collaboration. It was how do we work together as a team and not in silos? We have our next gen team over here, our community life team over there, our worship team over there. How does collaboration become part of our culture that we want to continue to deepen? Development, that if you're on our staff team, we want you to be growing professionally and personally in your life with God. And then fourthly, fun. We want there to be play and joy and laughter. We don't have Disney World. We have, I'm trying to think what we have, Adventureland. Oh, bootleg Disney out here, in New York. So it's not the
Coney
same.
Island.
Coney Island. It's too far from Queens. But fun, And so for us, naming those things have been really helpful. And then here's, I think, where folks get in trouble. We name the values or whatever's important to us. But to your point, Glenn, we don't have a rhythm of practices. How do we grow in these things? And so I've had to now rethink our staff meetings, our calendar. How do we take one of these aspects? Recently, we had one of our staff members who he's really just a coffee aficionado. And he did like a master class on making pour over coffees. And it was just a wonderful it was fun. But we have to think very clearly about that. And then what are the rhythms to celebrate? Recently we had our worship pastor and our tech director put together a weekend retreat for worship leaders, for those involved in tech, for ushers and greeters. And they came together to co-lead that. And so when our staff meeting came, we were just celebrating the gift of collaboration across the board. And so that's how I'm thinking about it. So the language, the stories, the practices, the rhythms, but it begins with getting clear on what are the things that's already happening that we want to name and then build on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that framework, Glenn. And I think I've heard you share that. I think I've heard you give that idea to leaders before. And so it's really helpful. I was actually writing it down because I really want to remember language, stories, practices, artifacts. And I think that that's something that we have found our way to somewhat intuitively, like the language that really shapes our leadership culture is that of integration. We often talk to not just our staff, but our leaders in the church as well about the goal is to be an integrated leader. And this shapes the expectations that we have for positions of spiritual authority. We say, we have these expectations, high expectations for people in spiritual authority, not because you are a better Christian, not because this is like varsity Christianity or we're more judgmental, but because we want to close as much as possible the gap between who you are in public and who you are in private. Because being an integrated person is how you flourish and how you thrive and how you grow spiritually. And then a lot of our practices are then trickle down from that language. So we have a really high culture of rest. We all Sabbath once a week. We, encourage taking time off, all of that. We have, it's interesting that you put this kind of under artifacts, but our performance reviews, I would have thought maybe under practices, but we have a high feedback culture where we have once a year anonymous 360 reviews, once a year a review from your supervisor. So just, really trying to cultivate, and that culture of feedback is very slowly cultivated. I don't know how you guys have experienced that, but it's taken a long time for people to get comfortable with that and for it to slowly shape our culture. But we're definitely doing a lot of those things intuitively. My question for you guys then is, what are some of the challenges that you have experienced around having a healthy culture? Like I one of the things that kind of keeps me up at night is I think that sometimes we're like the last ones to know if our culture has actually become unhealthy. I think other people can see it before we can. And that's really sobering to me. And so I'm curious if there's anything, if there's someone who's listening thinking, how do I know if I have cultivated a healthy culture? What might be undermining it? What would you say to them?
I mean, I think one of the challenges we had in the first year or so, we had about 25% of the staff transition on, and most of them, they self-selected. They go, I've helped hold the church together during a difficult time. I want to move on to something else, and that was okay. There's one or two people that we had to, make that decision for them in some way. It went well. It was peaceful by God's grace, but because of that, we were adding some high-level positions. So in a 6-month span, we added new worship pastor, new family ministries pastor, new youth pastor. So anytime you go through an acceleration of addition or growth, you're adding people quickly, and a lot of times you're adding people with some amount of seasoning and experience. And so people that are coming in, it's their second or third church they've worked for. They're going to import a certain way. They're going to import language, stories, practices, artifacts from another church. So you really have to slow down and to talk through a lot of things with them and to go, okay, that's great. Here's how at Rock Harbor we do it a little bit differently. And so I think for pastors and leaders, don't be afraid of articulating what your church's way is. And I've even had conversations with team members where to say, look, what you're expressing, the value that you are really convinced about, is a kingdom value. Like, it's beautiful. But I want you to know that particular way of expressing that conviction here is not going to have that, it's not going to be central for us, And so if you are going to be frustrated that this thing is not going to be, and take anything, it could be someone who's like, racial reconciliation is everything. I want every sermon, every small group, I go, man, that's an awesome kingdom value. We're going to actually approach it slightly differently. But if that's going to be frustrating to you, you might think about a different environment. Or someone who comes from a charismatic thing is like, man, every Sunday needs to be like a Holy Spirit altar call. You go, well, there'll be some Sundays like that, but if that's going to be frustrating to you, then, so accelerations and additions. But I think that the other thing I'm conscious of is also in growing seasons is the distance between the other leaders down the line. So the leaders that you as a senior leader are directly interacting with, you can shape them pretty consistently. But it's the ones 2 layers down, 3 layers down, particularly if they're volunteer leaders. I don't know how every small group leader is doing. Are they practicing, differentiation and healthy non-reactivity? And I don't know. So that's where you always have to keep your eye on the wheel here, hands on the wheel.
Along those lines, I think as leaders, we just have to anticipate culture inconsistency and just normalize it. That there's going to be times when our team, there's just a miss. We're human. We're flawed. There's going to be a miss. However, when that miss happens, I think that's the opportunity for us to clarify once again, clarity around expectations. And so, for example, here's a very real example for us happening. We've had, in a post-pandemic world, how do we negotiate how to leverage our building for the sake of the community around us? So New Life has a large building. We serve lots of different people, and there have been some misses around, like, what is the prime value of this building? What's the philosophy around our building? Therefore, and when that's not clarified, something's going to leak. There's going to be culture inconsistency. Now, in the past, how I would respond is, man, I wish somebody would do something about it, or just blame, or it's out there, or as opposed to, no, this culture gap is an opportunity for me to now clarify certain things. And so out of that, I wrote an entire document around, what, I'd like our building to be a place of hospitality, of safety, and responsibility. Let's hold these 3 values together as we think about stewarding our building in service of our congregation and our local neighborhood. But I think if there's going to be gaps, so don't get down on yourself when gaps surface, when there's inconsistency. It's like, this is the norm. This is what's going to happen. However, use that as an opportunity to re-clarify what those assumptions, what those values are.
That's where I just wanted to praise that, Rich, and to call that out for people. Like, you wrote something. You didn't just have a conversation.
That's right.
And you didn't ground it in, your preferences. I think the great trap for leaders when it comes to culture making is to make yourself the sun in the solar system. So people think that this is what the leader wants. Or if you're in a traditional church, well, pastor likes it this way. A pastor wants it this way. That is not culture making when everybody's orbiting around pastor's preferences. Culture making is when you externalize it. So you externalized it and you put it into a document. That's what I mean by codifying the culture with the language, with artifacts, words. Now everybody can look at that document and go, oh, I know what our culture is. Jim Collins in Built to Last, he calls this the difference between a time teller and a clock builder. A time teller has the magical gift of knowing what time of day it is. But if that time teller would build a clock, now everybody can tell what time it is. And that's the idea of culture making is if everything revolves around the leader, you haven't externalized the soul of the organization. And then to pick up on something you said, Sharon, you said feedback culture. I love that so much. Years ago, a consultant introduced me to this practice called an EBI, an even better if. And I try to model every week in every meeting I'm in to say, hey guys, any EBIs for me on the sermon? Any EBIs for me on that decision? Any decision we make, any event that we have, what are some EBIs? Last night we had a fundraising dinner for one of our global missions partners. I go, hey, can I offer some EBIs about how to make that dinner better? So now it's quick, it's painless. It's not hey, we need to sit down and have a confrontation. It's like we always assume, like you said, Rich, we always assume that we're going to miss the mark a little bit by 1%, 2%, and so how can we be 2%, 3% better next time?
I love too, Rich, with you mentioning that inconsistencies in culture is normal and is not a failure and is not something to feel ashamed of. Because one of the things that we have experienced that I think how we respond to it is actually culture shaping, is that we have built a really solid culture around rest, rhythms, healthy rhythms. And that culture is so strong that when Ike or I are ever out of step with it, like very clearly out of step with it, that our staff now reflects that back to us. And we'll hear it's not uncommon in meetings for it to be reflected back to us. Like, actually, you shouldn't be doing that. Like that isn't the culture that we have here. And there have been a number of key moments where that has happened. And in that moment, there is the temptation to either become defensive or to self-exempt, essentially, like, here's why this doesn't apply to me. And I think in that moment, what you're doing is communicating whether or not you actually believe in these cultural values or not. And so it's such an opportunity that is really challenging, but it's encouraging to hear from you guys that this isn't something that you just implement and it's just perfect and it just is self-sustaining, but that you continually are learning as you go. It's
and
really
along those
helpful.
lines, just if there's like an equation, it's those practices, plus processing. So to get culture really deep within a team, we have on the third Wednesday of each month, we have a day alone with God. We've been doing this for 20 years where we say, what, don't stay home. Don't come to the office, go to a coffee shop, the beach, whatever like that, and spend the time in prayer, reflection. Now that's the practice. But if there's no, how did that go? How did God meet you? There's no processing, then there's not going to be progress. And so how do we marry just the practices and the processing as opposed to these are our values, these are our practices and such, go ahead and do it. As opposed to, no, we have to spend some time processing together if this is going to get really embedded in our culture.
I just realized that's the piece we're missing. Practice plus process equals progress. That's what you said, Rich. That's what you said. That's what you said. Okay, Sharon, you sat down, Sharon, with Jenni Catron to talk about how to build a healthy staff culture. People might know Jenni is a former executive pastor, author, founder and CEO of the Foresight Group, where she and her team help leaders cultivate healthy leadership, thriving organizational cultures through coaching, courses, and practical frameworks. So let's go to Sharon, your conversation with Jenni Catron.
Well, Jenni, I am honestly stunned that we have not had you on this podcast yet.
I don't know how we haven't done this, but I'm so glad we are now. It's great.
I am too. For those of you who are not familiar with Jenni, she is truly a fount of wisdom, especially around leadership and leadership culture. And before I dive into our conversation, I actually wanted to cite evidence of this in my own life. So the last time you and I hung out, I think it was about a year ago, maybe.
I think so.
In
yeah,
Dallas.
last fall. Mm-hmm.
And two things that you said that I still think about on like a weekly basis. So one, I think you were maybe quoting John Maxwell. You had said you have to love people to lead people. I have written that down. If you could see in my office right now, it is written. There's a dry erase board like with my calendar
I love
hanging
it.
across on the wall from here. I've written that down. It's just a reminder to keep my heart soft towards the people I am called to.
Yeah.
But the other thing that you mentioned was around trust. And that's what we're going to be talking about is how do we cultivate trust in our staff culture?
Mm-hmm.
And you and I were talking about building trust with staff, and you'd made this comment, and I don't know if you were distilling somebody else's argument. I can't remember exactly. I've read so many books about trust, but this was so simple that it stuck with me. That you said trust is based on two things, character and competency.
Mm-hmm.
And that really was challenging to me because I think as a pastor, I have tended to lean hard into the character piece that
For sure.
as long as I am a good person, like as long as I am prayerful, as long as I am kind to my staff, I treat people well, that will build trust. But realizing that no, if you actually don't study, if you don't work, if you don't grow, if you don't demonstrate competency as a leader, that people might think you're the nicest person in the world, but that doesn't instill trust in them as a competent leader. And then vice versa, that you can be really gifted as a leader, but if they don't trust that your heart is ultimately for them, that also undermines trust. And so I have thought about that so many times since, just two nuggets that you dropped into my life. And so all that to say, I'm really excited for our listeners to hear more of that from you. Was there anything else you wanted to just add?
Well, I just love that stood out to you because those are just refrains that constantly live in my mind because they're the growth edges for me as a leader of, am I loving people to lead them? Because I'm so driven. I'm so ambitious. I want to accomplish so much. And the intent is always, is good most of the time, right? I mean, it's never perfect, but yeah, that heart for people, I think, is the thing that God just keeps working on me, is that in all that I'm pursuing and trying to do for him, people are still the point. And so I love that those things stood out because it's no surprise to me that that's the conversation we were having.
And I suspect a lot of leaders gravitate towards one or the other. Like they feel very strong in one of those. And so that two prongs of character and competency are such a great question for all of us to ask. Which one of those do I need to grow in? But along those lines, we are going to talk about trust, building trust among our staff, because Barna found that only about half of pastors strongly agree that their leadership team truly trusts each other, which is so interesting.
Crazy. Yeah.
And so I'm curious, why do you think trust is so fragile in many church teams? And what practical steps can pastors take to rebuild it?
Yeah. Well, and I think you set this up so well by framing that conversation that we had. Because, what I shared with you of that character and competency thing, it was really a reflection of, so we get the privilege, my team and I, to work with a lot of ministries, churches, nonprofits, et cetera, and helping them look at the health of their team and the team dynamics. And what we found with a number of the organizations that we've worked with in a lot of ministry context is that we would see these conflicting points of data in our surveys with teams, and that they trusted the individuals, but they didn't trust like the leadership team was usually how it would come out. It's like, I trust my senior leader or I trust my leader, but I don't trust the leadership team. And I was like, well, that feels conflicting. Like that wasn't making sense to me. And so as we dug in further, what we found is that in many cases, especially in ministry environments, they trusted the character of their leaders, like you and I were talking about. They trusted their heart, their motive, their moral integrity, et cetera. But then what it came down to is they didn't trust their competency for leading. And usually that was a matter of they didn't understand how decisions were made, or they weren't getting good communication around decisions or processes or so forth. And so we just found this unique tension that it was like, I trust them as a person, but I don't know if I trust them as a leader. And so it's hard to know necessarily when when Barna's doing the research here, and half of pastors, maybe some of them it's a character thing, maybe some of them it's a competency thing. But I think that would be the two things that I would lean into if I'm a church leader and I'm saying, gosh, first of all, that should be a warning flag. If half of church teams, their leadership teams don't trust each other, like, don't just dismiss and think your team's fine. Because one of the things I coach leaders all the time is that our culture is never as good as we think it is, especially the higher we are in the organization, the more blind spots we have to the reality. So I would just say, be a little vulnerable, put the curiosity hat on and go, okay, what if there's some mistrust within our team? And then just getting curious about, what does that look like? Maybe doing some assessing with your staff team of like, or if it's within the leadership team, hey, are there any places where, there's a little bit of mistrust, and what might that be about? And again, is it a character thing? Is it a competency thing? But I think it's helpful to look at those two categories and go, which one might it be? Because what I see for a lot of ministry teams is it comes down to more on the competency side. And when I say competency, sometimes we're like, well, I'm competent, but do we follow through? Are we accountable? Are we closing the loop on decisions that we're making? Because again, a lot of times as a leadership team, we think we've communicated things that we haven't communicated. And that can be a trust buster, right? Like we think that everybody knows how we arrived at a decision we got to, or that we've closed the loop and we've communicated. And then we find that actually we hadn't circled back on that as much as we thought we did. So I think the first step would just be to get curious and say, could there be a trust issue within our team? And then where's that coming from? That would be my starting point for that one.
So related to this, and I'm going to actually come back to this statistic later, but there's 3 in 5 church leaders report high levels of team health. But that number drops sharply among younger leaders and new staff. And in just a moment, I want to come back to why you think that might be. But related to the topic of trust, I have observed that part of what inhibits trust is also just the age of our staff, because our younger staff are learning and they are growing. And what that means is they have to be given some amount of margin to make mistakes. And how would you coach pastors who do have younger staff so that we can create that margin for young staff to learn and to grow and to be given opportunities to hold things that they might drop, but at the same time communicate to our staff that we know what we're doing? Like there's a method to the madness, like to instill trust at the same time.
Yeah, I love that you asked that question, because it's such a key tension right now, I think, in organization teams and there's a couple things going on. First of all, there's a ton of data around workplace culture right now that suggests that younger generations coming into the workforce trust senior leadership much less than they have historically. So our trust of senior leadership is lower than it's been. And we can kind of deduce why that is. It's kind of a broader culture issue of like, we're more skeptical of more senior leadership than probably in a good while. So younger leaders coming in are a little more skeptical of senior leadership. And so as a result, I remember my 20-something self who thought I knew everything and had everything figured out too. Sure. So there's just that. That's just what comes with the territory. So we were all there at one point as well. But here's the other thing. I think that, because now I'm one of the senior leaders in most every room I go into these days. And I'm like, how did I get here? I didn't realize I arrived here. But, we have to remember that our job as leaders is actually to develop others. I think sometimes we're so fixated on making things happen that we're looking for the most efficient route. And sometimes the most efficient route feels like just tell them exactly what to do and make sure they execute it. And we don't leave room for them to experiment, bring new and fresh and perspective and ideas. And so I think we have to slow down and remind ourselves that a key part of leadership is actually developing people, and developing people is coaching them, giving them some direction, but also giving them room to bring their own ideas and perspective and insights and questions to the process. And I think in our expediency, sometimes we neglect giving space for that. So I think there's a learning on both sides, that as younger leaders coming in, another thing that they're wrestling with is they grew up in a very accelerated culture where they expect to have access and authority immediately. And so there's a little bit of younger leaders, like when I came into the workplace, you expected to kind of pay your dues and, climb the ladder, so to speak. And younger leaders are just used to immediate access. They can DM celebrities on social media. So they're used to immediate access. And so they kind of come in assuming I should just be able to, just jump in and do things at a pretty high level. So there's learning on both sides. I think the senior leaders need to recognize and remember that coaching is a core part of what we're doing in developing people. And then younger leaders need to also demonstrate a little bit of patience and humility in seeking to learn and grow. So I think both sides, there's some growth there that needs to happen.
And that's really helpful to hear that is a trend, because I have talked to so many pastors who have had the experience of having staff in their 20s who are a little bit entitled or are overly boundaried, if that makes sense. It's kind of like their work-life balance is off kilter in the way of not having a robust work ethic. And if you don't know that this is a generational trend, it's easy to just think that this is a character failure in this young person in particular. But to know that maybe generationally, this is how they have been formed. And now they need to be sort of decatechized, so to speak, out of that into and coached how to step into that. That's really helpful. I feel like relationally, that's a really great reminder. Well, speaking of young people, I want to go back to that statistic I just mentioned about how 3 in 5 church leaders report high levels of team health, but that number drops sharply among young leaders and newer staff. What might this tell us about how team culture develops, and how can pastors intentionally accelerate trust and clarity? We talked a little bit about coaching young people, but practically speaking, what does that actually look like? How do we earn the trust of younger staff?
Yeah, such a great question, and an observation of that. That that number drops among young leaders, 3 in 5 report high levels of team health, but then the younger they are, the less we see that. And I think that's a reflection of, in a lot of, especially ministry church cultures, we rely on relationship to build trust, and which builds culture, right? Then time is the key ingredient of that. So among our, more seasoned leaders, our higher levels of leadership, they've had more time and proximity that has built trust, and then built culture. And they have that shared understanding of, this is my definition of culture, is who we are and how we work together to achieve the mission. So with those team members that have been together for a longer period of time, they've had the gift of time that has accelerated their understanding of, this is who we are and how we work together. So then when younger team members come in, they're trying to play catch up to all of this history, but oftentimes that history isn't documented. So it's like, oh, we do this, not that. Or this is, this story in our culture was so critical to, why we reach the community and the way we reach the community. And a young leader's like, why do we do that the way that we do that? And they have to mine for those stories. So one of the things that, and this is part of when we're coaching organizations around building great culture, the culture really needs a system. We don't need to leave it to this, hoping you catch it, because culture, or just the pace of organizational life is so accelerated, and people move so much more frequently. Like we stay in jobs far shorter period of time than we used to, even in ministry. Yeah. And so people are moving so frequently that we're not getting that same amount of time that builds the trust, that builds the culture. Mm-hmm. So leaders have to be really intentional to say, hey, we need to be clear about who we are and how we work together, not just hoping people will catch it by proximity, because that's a really bad strategy in general. We need to be more thoughtful about how do we help clarify, this is who we are, this is our mission, this is our vision, these are our values, here's the beliefs, the behaviors, and the stories that support that, our DNA of who we are. And this is what this looks like lived out. And that clarity, one of my convictions is that clarity is one of the chief indicators of the health of a culture within a team. The more clarity we provide, the more confidently people engage. And so my coaching to leaders would be, where can you provide clarity? What often happens is, as a senior leader, you'll be like, why in the world did they do that? Because that is not at all who we are. And I know we refrain from like we don't do things that way. We know those phrases aren't right, but we're thinking it. We're like, how in the world did they not know that that's not what we do? Well, we've never articulated it. And unless they're in our back pocket with us 24/7, they're unlikely to know that. So leaders need to be much more intentional to say, hey, this is put language, put story, articulate who we are, how we work together, give them the clarity. And the more clarity they have, the more confidently they contribute, and the more confidently they're contributing to our culture in a positive way.
Yeah. What I hear you saying, another way of putting this, is giving them the why.
And that's so good.
Why
you simplified that much better.
They are. Because I think it used to be, if the pastor said it, you did it. It's like, because I said so, essentially. And I've definitely observed with younger people that just isn't enough.
It's not enough.
Yeah. And I think that also just points to a larger cultural shift where pastors culturally, nationally, whatever you want to say, are no longer considered kind of the moral authority. Like the number of times people will just, if my husband and I reach out, that people will just ghost us. Like they just won't respond at all. And I've said to Ike so many times, like, if I was like a young person and my pastor reached out to me, that was like God reaching out to me. And so like the idea of not responding, it would have just been, impossible.
Like, this is so strange. Yeah.
But it has shifted where we don't have this just assumed authority anymore. And so it's easy to think, I told you to do it, and for them to push back, it's very clear that the culture has shifted, first of all, but they also need a really compelling why for behind it, is what I hear you saying.
That's right.
Related to that, so both internal trust and role clarity, so what you were just talking about, role clarity, were the two strongest indicators of team health in Barna's assessment. And so we already talked about trust. Let's talk a little bit more about role clarity. So you said a little bit about this, but I'd love to go deeper into why clarity around roles and expectations is so vital to creating a healthy culture, and also what happens when that clarity is missing.
Yeah, I love this. This is one of my favorite topics, by the way. So this one makes me excited. I'm a little bit of a geek for clear organizational structure, that everybody understands where they fit and why their role is mission critical. So that goes back to that why. And I think you said that really, really well, Sharon, that their expectations are different. Like, you just saying so doesn't work. It's like they need to understand the bigger picture, the why. And I think that's just respectful, honestly. Like, I don't know that I really faulted them for it. I think, gosh, I want to know why. I want to understand. My husband and I will be doing a project together, and I'm the worst, like, number 2 on a project. Like, if he's working on something and he's just like, give me this wrench or hold this right here, I'm like, why? Tell me the objective. What are we building? What's the big picture? Because, then I'm going to, and I probably am just a terrible follower, but when I have the big picture in mind, I think I contribute more effectively. And so the same is true organizationally, that And sometimes church leaders and ministry leaders are a little resistant to the idea of organizational structure. But my pushback on that is it's not about hierarchy, it's about clarity. And so the way I think about this is you have a mission that God has given you to fulfill. You probably have built a strategy to achieve that mission. How are you going to do it? What are the outreach, what's the discipleship plan, et cetera? Like you have your strategies. You need a structure of how you're organizing your people to achieve that strategy. So your organizational structure is a tool to serve your strategy that helps you achieve your mission. And so that org structure, every role then is mission critical. Like if that's the way you're thinking about it, every role is mission critical. And we know with ministry dollars, every role is mission critical because we only have so many ministry dollars to align around it, right? And then that cascades to volunteers as well. So when we do this well, we help team members see, here's the mission, here's the strategy, therefore, here's the structure and the roles that we need to help us achieve that mission. So your job is mission critical. You sit here and you report into this team or you report to this pastor because your role helps roll up to all of these things we're doing. So what that does is it gives every team member confidence that they're contributing to a mission that matters. They understand their place, their role, like how they interface with their coworkers, how they interface with the senior leaders. Like it just gives them a level of clarity. And what happens when we give that level of clarity is that they have more confidence to contribute. I really strongly believe that a lot of times the disengagement, the apathy, the bad attitudes maybe that we sometimes see in team members, or we feel like they're just not contributing very meaningfully. This is maybe my optimistic observation, is that there's a lack of clarity somewhere that's leading to that apathy or disengagement more so than an attitude problem. And that's always my coaching to leaders is, hey, start with is their behavior a clarity problem? And like check that first before you assume it's an attitude or a generational thing or whatever might be the case. Like, is it a clarity thing? Because I deeply believe that the more clarity team members have about their role, their place, their responsibilities, the more confidently they contribute to the work.
Can you give an example of, you can conceal the names or just give sort of a composite picture, but can you give an example of how you have seen that play out where it seemed like something was going on with the staff person personally, but really it was like a lack of clarity in the organization?
Yeah. Yes. Let me think of a good one. This was one of the teams that I got to serve. We had a leader who, again, we're on the brink of like letting that person go because they just seemed really disengaged. And it turned out that, I'm trying to figure out the way to like describe this without giving away too many like personal pieces, but they were in the, let's say they were in the children's ministry team. And some responsibilities had shifted of like new leader came in, roles had kind of shifted, and the new leader thought that they had given good clarity, but they had just verbalized it. They hadn't like redesigned job descriptions. And so what happened is there became confusion between two other team members. So new like next gen pastor comes in and we have two different people in kids ministry, and with one that was longer tenured, was a little frustrated because the new next gen pastor is taking on different responsibilities than the previous one had just by nature of personality, wiring, et cetera. The next gen pastor thought that they had articulated the differences, but they never actually like clarified them in any title change or specifically in their job descriptions. And so what happened is this person just started to slowly like just quit doing things because the things that they had historically done were now being done by somebody else. In the meantime, that leader's expecting that they're doing these other responsibilities, and this person doesn't fully understand that they're responsibilities. Again, new leader thinks that everything's clear. And as they dug in and started to put this person on a performance improvement plan, they were like, I honestly didn't know that that was the new expectation. I can do that. Right? Like, so it was like a conversation just all of a sudden cleared up all of the confusion. And not that there weren't some things to work through, because of course there was a mourning of the losing a couple of responsibilities that they had historically done, but then there was room for her to take on more things that she hadn't done previously. So again, it was one of those things that was like, we almost thought that that person wasn't going to make it through the transition of a new leader. And it really wasn't about the new leader. It was just about everything had shifted and she needed good clarity on who was doing what now.
Like they were holding her to expectations that had not actually been clearly communicated to her.
Right.
In the first place.
In her, she, and again, I think some of it had been verbal, but that's not always not always, doesn't always provide the level of clarity or making sure we have a shared understanding of that. So,
Yeah. I want to pause my conversation with Jenni to let you know about a really cool resource that our partner Belay is offering to help make church finances clearer, the Church Leader's Guide to Financial Clarity. If you've ever felt stretched thin between preaching, leading, and trying to make sense of spreadsheets, this guide is for you. Inside, you'll get 3 essential financial reports every church needs, plus simple templates to help you plan with accuracy and lead with confidence. For more than 15 years, Belay has matched pastors with U.S.-based remote assistants and financial experts who specialize in church finances. This guide is one more way they're helping you steward resources wisely. Download it for free by texting Barna to 55123. That's BARNA to 55123. So I want to go in a little bit different direction, which is on the topic of smaller or bivocational churches where staff culture, and this was absolutely my experience when we launched our church, staff culture really means volunteer culture.
Sure. Yep.
And man, oh man, if that is you listening, just all our love to you. it is really challenging. It is challenging when you cannot have the same expectations for volunteers as you would have for paid staff. And so how can pastors foster that same sense of trust, clarity, and shared mission among volunteers who serve alongside them week after week?
Yeah, I love that you asked this question because I've been a church planter. You've been a church planter. We've all been there and know what those seasons look like when it's like, I don't have paid people to help me do this. And honestly, Sharon, I wouldn't trade those days of my ministry journey for anything because it gave me even a deeper respect and understanding for leadership as influence rather than leadership as authority, right? So anyway, so I would just encourage those of you who are in that space where you're like, my whole team is volunteers. The clarity is really still really critical. And what you're looking for is how can I simply and consistently reinforce who we are and how we work together to achieve our mission. So here's something that I did way back in those days. So when you're thinking about if you have a staff team, you build out job descriptions and org structures and all those things, hopefully, because again, those are big points of clarity. You can still do that with volunteers, but it's very simple. It's a simple what's the objective of your volunteer role? And what are the 3 things you do every Sunday when you come in to do that role? And how much time do we think that takes? You're serving, 2 hours twice a month or whatever the case might be. That seems really obvious and simple to you as the leader, but that clarity helps them understand, oh, this is what's expected of me. Here's how I'm supposed to show up. Even having a simple org chart for, here's your kids ministry team and here's your kids ministry leader and here's your preschool leader and here's your elementary leader and then here's your classroom teachers. And you just have a simple structure. Because here's the thing, your volunteers are working in the marketplace every day. They are used to structures and job descriptions and role clarity that helps them understand how to contribute. So that is not foreign to them. They're actually really receptive of knowing, hey, here's how I contribute. This is what's expected of me. So it's very simple. Don't do a full page of stuff. Do a brief little paragraph, put your mission statement at the top of it. So you're reinforcing their understanding because again, they're not with you every day. They're maybe with you once a week. So you want to keep that in front of them on a really consistent basis. And then looking for in those huddles, build in those volunteer huddles every Sunday morning where you just remind them of here's what we do and here's why we do it. And here's the role you play is mission critical. Like, so just keeping that vision in front of them and looking for those micro moments, simple and consistent. You're doing the same things you would do if you had a full staff. You're just doing them on a much simpler and smaller scale.
Mm-hmm. That's so good. Because you want to honor the boundaries of your volunteers. Like you don't want to be just wringing them out when, like you said, they already have a job. And so they're really tired when they're coming in to serve and to lead.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I have found that people have a lot more capacity and a lot more endurance when they really believe
That's
in
right.
what it is they are doing. And so to keep casting that vision is actually going to be the fuel for their energy.
Yeah.
So
and they know
great.
that there's really a purpose behind it. Again, that it's mission critical, right? Like that they're not, oh, okay, if I come to hold the door, that might not matter, so much, because they will talk themselves out of the significance of it if we aren't reminding them of the purpose in it.
There is so much more that I want to ask you. We're not even getting to half of the questions I have for you.
That's probably because I'm long-winded.
2 questions that I have left. One is not a question that I gave you ahead of time, but you sort of alluded to it already. And this is one that haunts me as a leader. Is the reality that everyone can see you're unhealthy or that your staff culture is unhealthy before you can? I remember, I think it was a book about Pixar, maybe. They were talking about how they had this really high feedback culture. And our church staff has a really high feedback culture. And yet they discovered that they were still struggling to get honest feedback from their people and all the ways that they had to figure out their way around that. Like, how do we actually get real feedback? And so I was curious what you have found works well to continue to hear. Like we do anonymous 360 reviews once a year. We have 2 performance reviews twice a year. But what other best practices can we implement to make sure we are putting together like the clearest picture of our staff health?
Yeah, so good. Well, first of all, the fact that you do all of those things is like probably leaps and bounds ahead of where a lot of organizations, especially ministries, are. So building those rhythms of consistent feedback, of annual surveys, performance reviews, and actual meaningful discussions in those reviews is really important, that they're not just something you're checking off for HR to be happy, but it's like, again, as leaders, you're looking at those moments as really critical coaching and development time. So I think there's a perspective that leaders need to have on all of those tools that employees understand, or even key volunteers. They know whether you're doing this just to get it done, or whether you really have a heart of development and coaching that is and humility also to hear and get feedback. So your posture as a leader really impacts whether any of those tools are effective or not. And so that's almost the hard part, is that I could prescribe, and I do, because in the culture work that I prescribe, you're doing a ton of those tools, is do the assessments, do the 360s, do the performance reviews. You need those rhythms that create those places of consistent and natural feedback. Now, one of the big pieces on that is, first of all, how you handle those moments communicates whether you're actually receiving the feedback, right? So it takes so much humility on our part as leaders to engage those moments, especially when we're getting feedback, to really listen and to hear and not be defensive. And so, being well rested, prayed up, going into those moments with a posture of, there is something for me to learn. There's something for me to hear. There's no exchange for that, because that communicates so much to your team as to whether you really do have a feedback culture. And then also in especially staff-wide surveys and things, that we're constantly following back up to communicate what we heard and what we're doing about it. Because one of the things that I see erode culture frequently is organizations that do the survey but never respond back to it. And so team members feel like it went into this black hole. We did the survey. No, I mean, I've literally had, when I've facilitated surveys for organizations, I've literally had people put in the comment section, I don't even know why I'm saying this because I don't think they're going to do anything with it. They never have in the past. I mean, they have literally put that in there, and I'm like, oh, game on! Like, I am ready. We are responding, not not directly to that comment, but we're like, no, we are actually listening, and we're going to respond this time, and I'm going to help coach this organization to do that. So those are a couple of things, Sharon. It's like those are the culture's an interesting bit because there is a system that we need to build to reinforce our culture. And that's one of the things I think that oftentimes we neglect, because we think when we hear culture, we think it's organic and it's relational, and it is, but it needs a system for consistency, just like every other key initiative in your ministry. Like your culture, your stewardship of your people, which is the heart of culture, is the stewardship of your people. It needs a system. And yet there is that relational, intuitive, discerning side of leading well, leading culture well, that I can't fully prescribe. Like it's the posture, it's the heart, it's your attitude as a leader that's ultimately what people see, experience, and feel. And so the biggest question we have to ask ourselves is, do I really have a heart to lead? What's my philosophy around leadership? Do I really think that leadership isn't about me? It's not for me. It's not about everything I'm achieving. It's about what am I doing to draw out the giftedness of the people that God has entrusted me to lead, that this stewardship responsibility. I really my deep conviction is that leadership is sacred work because we're changing and affecting the lives of people because of our influence and oftentimes our position of leadership. And so holding that as a sacred responsibility, I think it's really the heart of leading and building culture.
Gosh, that is such a challenging reminder to me that, when you go into a meeting where you're going to receive feedback, it's so easy to go in guarded.
For sure.
And almost like I just need to get through this without having a bad attitude, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
And to remember, no, I need to pray. I need to, like you said, be well rested, to be in a place where I can receive, and to coach our staff to receive their feedback. That's don't just come into this, don't just squeeze this in the middle of a bunch of stuff going on. This is really valuable for your growth, for the stewardship of what God has put in you.
That's right.
And so to go in with that posture, I love that. All right, last question. So the subtitle of your new book, Culture Matters, which I highly recommend to everyone listening, but the subtitle is A Framework for Helping Your Team Grow, Thrive, and Be Unstoppable. And so could you give us a quick overview of what that framework looks like and one clear next step that pastors and leaders can take toward building a healthy, thriving leadership culture?
For sure. Yeah. And I'll do this quick because I think we've hit on some of it just in our conversation. But this framework that I built, that I share in the book, was really a reflection of me trying to figure this out active in real time when I was an executive pastor on church staff, of going, our people are so critical. And if I'm not stewarding them well, it doesn't matter how great the mission is. It doesn't matter how amazing our strategy is. If I don't have a team of people that are aligned and on mission with me, then it's all, the rest of it's almost irrelevant, right? The people are the linchpin to actually accomplishing the work that God has called us to. So this was me trying to figure out, what's the process? What's the system that helps me build a culture, especially at scale? And any ministry, regardless of how big your staff is, you have a scale of a team of volunteers that you can't personally spend time with every person to make sure they understand who you are and how you work together. So you really, truly need a system that helps reinforce that, so everybody's in alignment towards that mission. So there's 5 phases of the framework. We've talked about assessing your culture, just what's true of your culture right now, getting feedback, defining what is it actually, putting language, putting words to it, values are a big anchor to that of what are core to how we show up and work together. But like digging deeper into that of like, well, why does that matter? What does it look like? Putting language around it is really, really key. The third part of it is just equipping your team, like making sure that every leader at every level understands and has that true conviction of this is who we are. This is how we work together. And they are cascading that to the teams that they lead. And then, and I missed build a plan. 3 is build the plan. Build a plan to close the gap between where we are, where we want to be. Then equip your leaders. And then finally, just commit to the process, right? Like culture building is not a one and done. It's not like you do a big staff rally and like, staff fun day and you're like, whoo, our culture is great for a year. Your culture is building or eroding in every one of those micro moments of engagement every day, which can feel a little bit overwhelming. But when you start to look at it through that lens, you realize that every day I am reinforcing who we are and how we work together. And so just that ongoing commitment to that. So the book walks you through all of those phases of what that looks like and how to put it into action. And what I would tell leaders is start with assessing just what's true in our culture. Maybe you do a staff-wide assessment. Maybe you do some focus groups. There's some tools that I have in the book that can help you do that quick assessment of where are we, what's true. Because when you know where you are, you can then start building a plan to where you want to go.
Awesome. Well, there's, as I said, so much more that I would love to pick your brain about, but thankfully you wrote an entire book. And so we have that resource available. And then we'll also put additional resources in the show notes of this episode as well. But as I mentioned, Jenni has so much experience, honestly, speaking into this, and you are stewarding it so well. I'm so grateful for you. Would you mind closing us by just praying over pastors? I know my heart, and I'm sure the same for you, is not for pastors to leave this conversation feeling like, oh, I have so much to do now. And I know that's not at all what we want to communicate. So could you pray just a prayer of grace over everyone who's listening right now?
Yes, for sure. Thanks, Sharon. God, I am, first of all, just so grateful for every pastor who's listening, for the sacred call on their life and the ministry that they lead and the work that you've given them to do, God. And we know that there's just a weight to shouldering that. And God, I pray that even through this conversation, just as Sharon just said, that this is not more to do, but it's more of just understanding your heart for people. God, I always come back to the great commandment of love God and love others. And there's just a sacredness to the leadership role, to the work that you've called us to, that we are changing and affecting the lives of the people that we lead. And in many ways, our staff are our first congregation. They're the first group of people that you've called us to steward and to lead. And God, I pray that you would just give all of the pastors listening just an extra grace for the humility, the understanding, the sensitivity, the just wisdom to know how to meet their team members where they are and to lead them with just a heart for who they're becoming, who they are, how you've gifted them. God, I pray that that this wouldn't be more a burden, God, but that it would be a joy to lead and to serve and to see people really as the point of the work that we get to do, God. So I pray that the right nugget would come out of this conversation, and that ultimately, God, our hearts would just be to lead well, to honor you, to steward the people you've entrusted us to lead, and to trust you with all the other details in it. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Well, I loved that conversation I had with Jenni. She is so wise, such a gift to the church, and I'm glad that you guys got to hear from her. But thank you for being a part of the Resilient Pastor podcast, where Barna comes alongside pastors like you with research and encouragement for the road ahead. If this episode resonated with you, like it and share it with another leader, and discover more resources to help you and your team thrive at barna.com. And thanks again to our awesome partner, Belay. Don't forget to check out Belay's free resource, The Church Leader's Guide to Financial Clarity. It's packed with practical templates and tools so you can stop guessing and start leading with confidence. Text Barna to 55123 to download now. That's BARNA to 55123. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the Resilient Pastor Podcast.